This is the moment 7 years of American foreign policy finally collapsed under its own weight. Picture this: a deal that took 12 years to negotiate, that involved 6 world powers, that froze Iran's nuclear program and put international inspectors inside its most sensitive facilities, torn up, not renegotiated, not improved, torn up, thrown in the trash, and replaced with a promise that something better was coming. That was 2018. Today, in 2025, Iran is enriching uranium at 60% purity, dangerously close to weapons grade. It has more advanced centrifuges spinning right now than it did the day that deal was destroyed. It has expelled international inspectors from its most critical nuclear sites. And the United States is sitting across the water with 3 carrier strike groups, a naval blockade, and a president who just told the world he is ready to go to war. If you look at what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now, the warships, the seized vessels, the oil market in chaos, and you want to understand how we got here, there is one decision made on one afternoon in May 2018 that explains almost everything. As of this recording, Tuesday, April 22nd, 2025, the ceasefire between Washington and Tehran is hours from expiring. Nuclear talks are stalled, oil is trading near $97 a barrel, and the world is staring down a crisis that did not have to happen. In this video, we are going to go back to the beginning. We are going to show you exactly what the original nuclear deal actually did, why Trump walked away from it, what he promised in its place, and why, step by devastating step, that decision has produced the most dangerous American confrontation with Iran since the hostage crisis of 1979. Trump did not just tear up a deal, he lit a fuse. And right now, the world is watching to see where the explosion lands. If you are not yet subscribed, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. This story goes deeper than any single headline. You need to see the full picture, and we are going to give it to you. To understand why we are here, you have to understand what the deal actually was and what it actually did. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, known as the JCPOA, was signed in July 2015 after 12 years of on and off negotiations involving the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Russia, China, and Iran. It was not a perfect agreement. Nobody who negotiated it called it perfect. But it accomplished something that decades of sanctions and threats had failed to achieve. It put a hard cap on Iran's nuclear activities. Under the deal, Iran agreed to reduce its uranium stockpile by 98%. It agreed to cap enrichment at 3.67% purity, nowhere near the 90% required for a nuclear weapon. It agreed to dismantle 2/3 of its centrifuges. And critically, it agreed to allow inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency into its facilities on a regular, verifiable basis. In exchange, the United States and its allies agreed to lift the crushing economic sanctions that had been strangling Iran's economy for years. Was Iran happy about this deal? Absolutely not. They gave up enormous capability. Were Western allies happy? Not entirely. There were real concerns about what happened after the deal's key restrictions expired in 15 years. But the consensus among nuclear nonproliferation experts at the time was clear and nearly unanimous. The JCPOA made the world measurably safer. It pushed Iran's breakout time, the time it would take to build a nuclear weapon if it decided to, from roughly 2 months to over a year. That was the deal. That was what was working. Before we go further, drop a comment below. Do you think pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal was the right call, or was it the biggest foreign policy mistake of the last decade? Tell us what you think. We read every single one. Then came 2016. And everything changed. During his presidential campaign, Donald Trump described the JCPOA in language that was blunt and unambiguous. He called it the worst deal ever negotiated. He called it a disaster. He promised that if elected, he would tear it up on day one and replace it with something far stronger, far more comprehensive, and far more favorable to American interests. His argument rested on 3 specific criticisms. First, the deal did not address Iran's ballistic missile program. Second, it did not deal with Iran's support for proxy militias across the Middle East, Hezbollah, the Houthis, various Iraqi factions. Third, the sunset clauses meant that many of the deal's restrictions would expire after 15 years, at which point Iran would be free to resume full nuclear activities. These were real criticisms. Serious people on both sides of the political aisle acknowledged them. But here is the question that mattered, the question that the architects of the withdrawal never fully answered. What comes next? What is the plan? What does better terms actually look like? And how do you get Iran to agree to them after you have just destroyed the only diplomatic framework that existed? Trump's answer was maximum pressure, crippling sanctions, economic strangulation. He gambled that Iran's economy would collapse fast enough and hard enough that the regime would have no choice but to come back to the table, this time on America's terms, accepting every demand Washington made. He assumed Iran would fold. He assumed wrong. On May 8, 2018, at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time in the White House diplomatic reception room, Donald Trump stood before the cameras and signed the paperwork withdrawing the United States from the JCPOA. The room was quiet for a moment after he finished signing. Then the applause from the assembled officials began. Careful, measured applause, not triumphant. The people in that room understood what had just been set in motion. Within hours, European leaders, Angela Merkel of Germany, Emmanuel Macron of France, Theresa May of the United Kingdom, issued a joint statement expressing regret and concern. These were not America's enemies. These were its closest allies, the same partners who had spent years sitting alongside American negotiators to build the deal that had just been destroyed. Their message was careful but clear. This is a mistake. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, appeared on state television holding the text of the JCPOA in his hand. He held it over a flame. He burned it on camera. And he said something that Western analysts would quote for years afterward. I told you Americans cannot be trusted. But here is where the story gets complicated and dangerous. While the White House was celebrating the withdrawal, something else was also happening inside Iran's nuclear establishment. Quietly, methodically, and with careful attention to international optics, Iranian engineers began the process of reversing every commitment the JCPOA had required them to make. The centrifuges that had been disconnected were reconnected. The uranium stockpile that had been shipped out of the country began to grow again. Enrichment levels that had been capped at 3.67% began climbing, 5%, then 20%, then 60%. New underground facilities hardened against airstrikes went under construction. And the IAEA inspectors who had been given access to Iran's most sensitive sites were one by one turned away at the gate. At that exact same moment, America's sanctions campaign was producing exactly the economic pressure Washington had promised, and exactly the political backlash it had not anticipated. Pause. Iran's economy contracted by 6% in 2018, by nearly 8% in 2019. Inflation crossed 40%. The Iranian rial lost over 60% of its value against the dollar within 18 months of the withdrawal. Ordinary Iranians, not the Revolutionary Guard commanders, not the regime's political elite, but regular people, watched their savings evaporate, their purchasing power collapse, and their futures shrink. Did they blame the regime? Some did, but a significant portion blamed the United States. And the regime used that anger brilliantly. Every piece of economic suffering became proof in their telling of American cruelty. Every sanction became a recruiting poster for hardline nationalism. The moderate Iranian politicians who had staked their careers on the JCPOA, who had told their people that engagement with the West was possible and worthwhile, were politically destroyed. The hardliners who had always said America could not be trusted were vindicated beyond their wildest expectations. And most shockingly, the strategic outcome that maximum pressure was supposed to produce, the thing the entire policy was built around, never happened. Iran did not come crawling back to negotiate. It dug in, it accelerated. And by 2021, when the Biden administration tried to revive some version of a nuclear deal, Iran came to the table with twice as many centrifuges spinning, uranium enriched to levels the JCPOA had specifically banned, and a political establishment so thoroughly dominated by hardliners that any deal flexible enough for America to accept was impossible for Iran's domestic politics to survive. The better deal that Trump had promised was never defined, never drafted, and never negotiated. It existed as a slogan, and slogans do not stop uranium enrichment. What the public never fully saw, what the press conferences and the cable news segments never captured, was the internal debate inside the Trump administration in the months before the withdrawal. According to reporting by Bob Woodward, confirmed by multiple former officials cited in subsequent books and investigations, the national security apparatus was deeply, bitterly divided over the withdrawal decision. Then Secretary of Defense James Mattis argued against withdrawal in a private memo to the president that was, by all accounts, unusually blunt for a document of its kind. His core argument, according to officials who read it, the JCPOA was imperfect, but walking away without a plan for what came next would produce an Iran that was more dangerous, more nuclear capable, and harder to negotiate with than the Iran that existed the day the deal was signed. Mattis, a four-star general who had spent a career studying Iran's military capabilities, was warning in writing that withdrawal was a strategic error. He was overruled. We have also learned from sources familiar with the internal deliberations that in the weeks before the announcement, a private back-channel approach was made to European partners, specifically Germany and France, asking whether they might be willing to help pressure Iran into accepting modifications to the deal rather than full withdrawal. The Europeans, according to these sources, offered a concrete counterproposal, a supplemental agreement that would address the ballistic missile program and the sunset clauses while keeping the core nuclear restrictions intact. The conversation, according to one official who participated in it, lasted about 40 minutes. Then the decision from the White House came back, no, we are pulling out. The participants, senior officials from the National Security Council, the State Department, and the Treasury Department. The topic, not whether to withdraw, but how to manage the fallout, because by that point, the decision had already been made. It was a cold, calculated political decision that had almost nothing to do with nuclear nonproliferation strategy and almost everything to do with domestic political messaging. The JCPOA was Barack Obama's signature foreign policy achievement. Destroying it was not primarily a national security decision. It was a statement. It was a repudiation of everything Obama had built. It was base politics dressed up in strategic language. They looked at the political rewards of the Obama deal destroyed headline, which energized the Republican base. They looked at the short-term foreign policy messaging win, which played well with Gulf state allies who despised the deal. And they calculated that the long-term consequences, the nuclear acceleration, the hardliner empowerment, the diplomatic isolation, would be someone else's problem to manage later. What they did not calculate, what the hot mic moment of history has since revealed, is that later arrived faster than anyone expected. And it arrived in the form of the worst American-Iranian confrontation in 40 years, playing out in the Strait of Hormuz, with oil markets in chaos and 3 aircraft carriers pointed at a country that now has more nuclear capability than it has ever had in its history. Why did this happen? Not just politically, but strategically. How did a decision made to produce a better outcome produce, by almost every measurable standard, a dramatically worse one? Follow the incentives. Maximum pressure theory rests on a specific assumption about how authoritarian regimes respond to economic pain. The assumption is squeeze hard enough and the cost of defiance becomes greater than the cost of compliance. The population suffers, the leadership calculates that survival requires compromise, and a deal gets done on the stronger party's terms. That model works. Sometimes. It worked partially with certain elements of Libya's weapons program. It worked with specific trade disputes in less politically charged contexts. But it fails reliably when applied to a regime whose entire political identity is built on resistance to American pressure. The Islamic Republic of Iran was founded on anti-American ideology. Its creation myth is inseparable from its opposition to Western imperialism. When Washington applies maximum pressure, it does not weaken that narrative. It confirms it. Every sanction, every seizure, every threat is exactly what the hardliners have been predicting for 40 years. And a regime that can say, "See, we told you so," to its own population is a regime that has paradoxically been politically strengthened by the pressure designed to destroy it. This shifts the power balance in a way that maximum pressure theory never accounted for. The JCPOA had shifted power from Iran's hardliners to its moderate technocratic establishment. Rouhani and Zarif, the Iranian officials who negotiated the deal, represented a faction that believed Iran could engage with the West without compromising its sovereignty. The withdrawal didn't just destroy the deal, it destroyed that faction. It ended their political relevance. And it handed total control of Iranian nuclear and foreign policy to the IRGC commanders who had opposed the deal from the beginning. What historians will call the JCPOA collapse is now recognized across the foreign policy establishment, even among people who were skeptical of the original deal, as a case study in strategic overreach. This is the Icarus problem, flying too close to the sun, believing that maximum force always produces maximum results without accounting for the ways that force can backfire. The legal and constitutional dimensions of the current crisis trace directly back to that 2018 decision. Because the United States withdrew from the JCPOA unilaterally, without congressional authorization, through executive action alone, the diplomatic infrastructure that surrounded the deal began to unravel. European partners who had built their Iran policy around American participation found themselves without a partner. The snapback sanctions mechanisms that the U.S. had relied on to enforce Iranian compliance became legally disputed. International courts began considering challenges to American sanctions policy, and the multilateral consensus that had made the original deal enforceable collapsed into a fractured, every nation for itself scramble. By destroying the deal alone, America also destroyed its ability to rebuild it with partners. And a deal rebuilt alone, which is what the current negotiations in Islamabad essentially amount to, is a deal that is far weaker, far less verifiable, and far less likely to hold than the one that was burned in 2018. Let's examine the nuclear mechanics of where things actually stand today. In 2018, when the U.S. withdrew, Iran's uranium stockpile was approximately 300 kilograms, all at low enrichment levels. Today, according to the most recent IAEA reports before inspectors were expelled, Iran's stockpile had grown to over 4,500 kilograms, with significant portions enriched to 60% purity. To put that in plain language, 60% enrichment is one technical step away from 90%, which is weapons grade. The gap between where Iran is today and a functional nuclear device is measured not in years, as it was under the JCPOA, but potentially in weeks. Here is why this matters for the human beings watching this video. A nuclear-armed Iran changes the security calculations of every country in the Middle East overnight. Saudi Arabia has already publicly indicated it would pursue its own nuclear program if Iran obtained a weapon. Turkey has made similar noises. Egypt, the United Arab Emirates. The chain reaction of proliferation that a nuclear Iran would trigger is the kind of scenario that keeps non-proliferation experts awake at night, not because it is science fiction, but because it is the logical and predictable consequence of a strategic failure that began with a signature on a piece of paper in May 2018. Here is the domino effect that the 2018 withdrawal has now fully set in motion, and that the current crisis is accelerating toward its conclusion. If the ceasefire expires this week without a new framework, Iran's IRGC gains full operational authority over its response. If the IRGC gains that authority, expect immediate escalation in the Strait, not a full closure, but targeted harassment designed to spike oil prices and inflict maximum economic pain with minimum direct military engagement. If oil crosses $110 a barrel, the Federal Reserve faces impossible choices. If the Fed is forced to respond to an oil-driven inflation shock with rate decisions, the fragile global economic recovery that markets have been counting on through 2025 collapses. We are looking at a chain of consequences that started with one man's signature on one afternoon in 2018, and that is now threatening to produce a global recession, a possible regional war, and a nuclear proliferation cascade simultaneously. China is watching every second of this, but not because it wants to help resolve it. China has quietly purchased Iranian oil at massive discounts throughout the maximum pressure period, discounts that have kept Iran financially alive while simultaneously allowing Beijing to build up its strategic petroleum reserves at a fraction of market cost. A weaker Iran is, from China's perspective, a better commercial partner. But a nuclear Iran changes the calculation entirely. A nuclear Iran means a nuclear Saudi Arabia. A nuclear Saudi Arabia means a fundamentally transformed Middle East power structure. And a transformed Middle East means the entire architecture of China's Belt and Road investment strategy, built on relationships with governments whose survival depends on stable oil markets, becomes unpredictable overnight. Xi Jinping did not publicly oppose the JCPOA withdrawal in 2018. But inside Beijing's foreign policy establishment, the decision was described, according to diplomatic sources, as the single greatest gift to Chinese strategic positioning since the Iraq War. Because every time America destroys a multilateral framework, China is positioned as the responsible actor, the grown-up in the room, the stable partner, the reliable friend. And yet China cannot afford the war that maximum pressure is now threatening to produce. This creates a fascinating and dangerous paralysis in Beijing, watching a crisis that benefits them strategically while threatening them economically, with no obvious way to intervene that does not either deepen their complicity or expose their own vulnerabilities. Where is Europe in all of this? Silence. Again. The European signatories to the JCPOA, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, spent 3 years after the American withdrawal trying to keep the deal alive through a financial mechanism called INSTEX, designed to allow trade with Iran without triggering American sanctions. It failed. It processed a handful of small transactions and then quietly dissolved. European companies, terrified of American secondary sanctions, had already fled the Iranian market before INSTEX was even fully operational. Europe's silence now is not passive. It is the silence of a party that tried, failed, and has no remaining credibility as a mediator. They cannot offer Iran economic relief because their own companies refuse to engage with Iran under the shadow of American sanctions. They cannot pressure Washington because their security relationship with the United States makes direct confrontation politically impossible. They are spectators at a crisis they partially created by failing to prevent the 2018 withdrawal with more forceful opposition. This creates a fracture in the Western alliance that runs deeper than the current crisis. On one side, the American maximalist position, which insists that no deal is worth signing unless it permanently eliminates Iran's nuclear capability, addresses its missile program, and curtails its proxy activities across the region, essentially demanding that Iran transform itself into a different kind of state. On the other side, every serious nuclear non-proliferation expert on the planet who will tell you that demanding everything from an adversary in a position of desperation does not produce compliance. It produces radicalization. A divided Western policy cannot solve a problem this complex, and a divided Western policy is exactly what the destruction of the JCPOA produced. Reports from individuals familiar with the current U.S. negotiating team describe internal frustration bordering on despair. The problem, as one source characterized it, is that the administration is simultaneously demanding more from Iran than any previous agreement has required, while offering Iran less economic relief than the original JCPOA provided, while applying military pressure that makes any Iranian leader who concedes look weak at home. The negotiating math simply does not add up. You cannot offer less while demanding more while threatening war and expect a durable agreement to emerge from the ruins. The staff working these negotiations know this. The question is whether the people making the final decisions are listening to them. The burning page is not just a piece of paper. When Khamenei held the JCPOA over that flame in May 2018, doing theatrically what Trump had done legally hours earlier, he was burning something more than a diplomatic document. He was burning the last remaining argument that pragmatic Iranian officials had for trusting American commitments. He was burning the political futures of every Iranian technocrat who had told their people that a deal with Washington was worth the compromises it required. And he was burning, with it, the possibility of the kind of step-by-step, verification-based, trust-building process that is the only way complex nuclear agreements between adversaries actually survive long-term. You can tear up an arms control agreement, but you cannot tear up the nuclear knowledge that agreement was designed to contain. You can tear up an inspection regime, but you cannot unenrich uranium that has already been enriched. You can tear up a diplomatic framework, but you cannot rebuild the trust it embodied by threatening the people who relied on it. Reality does not negotiate. Reality does not accept executive orders. Reality is what it is. Iran has more nuclear capability today than it had the day the deal was destroyed. The breakout time, that critical window between Iran's current capabilities and an actual nuclear weapon, has shrunk from over a year to potentially weeks. The inspectors who could tell us exactly where things stand have been expelled. And the military option that would destroy Iran's facilities, the airstrikes and bunker busters that hawks have always kept in the background as the ultimate last resort, would set Iran's program back by 2 or 3 years at most, while guaranteeing a level of regional retaliation that would make the current crisis look like a warm-up. So where are we, honestly, in April 2025? We are in a situation where the maximum pressure strategy has succeeded in making Iran poorer and angrier, but has failed completely in making it less nuclear. We are in a situation where the military pressure in the Strait has succeeded in seizing one cargo vessel and spiking global oil prices, but has not produced a single verifiable nuclear concession from Tehran. We are in a situation where the better deal that justified destroying the original one remains, 7 years later, undefined, unsigned, and as far from reality as it was the day it was promised. Trump is in the White House facing a deadline he created, a crisis he inherited from his own first-term's decisions, and a military posture that gives him enormous short-term leverage while painting him into a corner where his only options are a war nobody wants or a deal that his own political base will call a surrender. Iran's supreme leadership is managing a fractured economy, a population that is exhausted by sanctions and instability, a military establishment that is genuinely capable of inflicting painful asymmetric damage, but genuinely incapable of winning a sustained conventional war against the United States, and an internal political debate between hardliners who want escalation and pragmatists who understand that the math is not in their favor. Both sides are standing at the edge of something they cannot fully control. Both sides know that miscalculation, a single accident, a single overreach, a single decision made in anger rather than strategy could produce a war that reshapes the Middle East for a generation. As we head into the next critical 72 hours, expect the noise to get louder and the actual decisions to get quieter. Expect public ultimatums and private back channels. Expect oil markets to remain volatile and global allies to remain silent. Expect both governments to present their domestic audiences with strength while quietly searching for the off-ramp that lets them step back without losing face. But here is the irreversible conclusion of this story, the one that no deal, no ceasefire, no diplomatic breakthrough will change. The JCPOA is gone. The trust it required is gone. The multilateral framework that made it verifiable is gone. What remains is a harder problem facing harder men in a more dangerous world than the one that existed before May 8th, 2018. The better deal was never built. The disaster, however, is unfolding exactly on schedule. History will record what was promised and what was delivered. And the distance between those two things, between the promise of better terms and the reality of 3 aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Oman, is the full measure of what was lost when one administration decided that tearing something down was easier than making it better. We will be here to report every development as this crisis moves toward its resolution or its explosion. The ceasefire deadline is hours away. The talks are hanging by a thread, and the world is watching a problem that was made in Washington in the full light of day in front of every camera on the planet. Subscribe right now if you are not already. Hit the notification bell, because in the next 72 hours, history is going to move fast, and you need to be here when it does. If this video gave you a clearer understanding of how the world arrived at this moment, hit the like button right now. It is the single most important thing you can do to help this analysis reach the people who need to see it. Subscribe to this channel and turn on every notification. We are covering this crisis in real time with the depth it deserves. No noise, no spin, just the full picture. The disaster is unfolding. Be here for every chapter of it. Stay alert, watch closely. The clock is running.